Bon après-midi, tout le monde.
Good afternoon, one and all. I believe that everybody is set up and connected, and probably to facilitate the Zoom meeting, the hybrid meeting. I won't repeat all the usual mise en scène. We have the pleasure of inviting and receiving our Honourable Minister, Steve Godbout, who will start with an opening remarks, and we'll give him 10 minutes. Mr. Minister, without any further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Chair.
Strengthening Environmental Protection for a Healthier Canada Act, which proposes amendments to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. J'aimerais débuter par reconnaître.
I'd like to begin by, first of all, recognizing that we find ourselves on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe First Nations, Inuit and Métis. These are not just empty words. There's a sincere and fundamental recognition that we have to work on daily to renew relationships with our Indigenous populations.
Yes. Recognizing a right to a healthy environment as provided under CEPA, and strengthens the management of chemicals and other substances. Lorsque j'ai présenté mon allocution de...
When I presented my opening remarks at the Senate committee last spring, I invited senators to study and seek ways to improve the bill. I thank the Senate for the important work, and I would repeat this offer for the members of the House of Commons. The government supports many of the Senate amendments and will propose that some of them be modified and amended so that they're more workable, and there are a few, which we'll return to later, which are not in keeping with the principles of the Act or are premature in light of ongoing consultations. Let's begin with building a healthy environment by way of the Environmental Protection Act.
The environment will be recognized in a federal statute. The bill also includes a number of requirements to ensure the right is meaningful and taken into account when making decisions under CEPA. It requires the government to develop, within 2 years, an implementation framework describing how this right will be considered in the administration of the Act. This framework will explain, among other things, how principles of environmental justice, non-regression, and intergenerational equity will be considered under CEPA. La population canadienne aura l'occasion de participer.
The Canadian population will have an opportunity to participate in the development of this framework. The Minister, myself, will report annually to Parliament on the framework implementation. And this will reflect a reasoned, patient, and evolving approach to environmental law. The framework will specify the perspective of rights to a healthy environment and the programs of the CEPA and the programs of air quality and control of chemical products. These amendments to the law will confirm government's commitment to implement the Declaration in the United Nations on UNDRIP, and the importance of holding our vulnerable populations as a priority in attaining of these rights. These new requirements will call for research and studies on certain areas because the new requirements could help address, for instance, the needs of individuals.
Robust regime of procedural rights in CEPA that provides for public participation, investigation of offenses, and environmental protection actions. CEPA has requirements to publish information and maintain the CEPA online registry, which we continuously improve. It allows anyone to ask for an investigation of an alleged offense. If the request is not dealt with in a reasonable manner, the person can bring an environmental protection action in the courts to enforce compliance. As well, any person who has suffered loss or damage as a result of a contravention of CEPA can bring a civil action to recover those damages. Le projet de loi offre au public.
The bill offers the public many manners to participate in the decision-making process, making it more transparent and accessible. For example, they'll be able to participate in the development of the implementation plan, the management of priorities and chemical. We also have a mechanism which allows the public to demand an evaluation and consolidate the list of substances which are reasonably suspected to be toxic should their use change.
In this bill relates to the modernization.
Pardon, Monsieur le ministre, on me dit que l'interprétation a un peu de misère à vous entendre. Peut-être que le micro est peut-être trop haut placé. Ouais, ça doit être
est-ce que c'est mieux comme ça?
Je vois pas. Est-ce que c'est mieux comme ça? Non, je regarde là, les cabines. Est-ce que c'est mieux?
Point of order.
I can't see what they're telling me.
There was just no translation on your français.
Oh, OK.
So I'm not sure if it goes both ways.
Là, on a un deuxième problème, c'est qu'on...
Well, we have another problem. Apparently, the interpretation wasn't working at the time. Alors, Mr. Minister, could you tell us what that means, in fact? It's good? Is it good?
Est-ce que je dois prendre une partie ou
Non, je crois pas, mais...
OK.
No need to repeat, or just carry on as it is, and we will muddle through.
So the second set of key changes proposed in this bill relates to the modernization of chemical management. Canada is recognized as a world leader, being the first and only country to have categorized and prioritized for assessment all of the substances that were in commerce in our economy at the time of the original CEPA was enacted in 1988. By the end of 2022, the government will have completed the assessments for almost all, 98.5%, of the 4,636 substances that were identified as priorities when the Chemicals Management Plan was launched in 2006. This is progress. Mais nous avons maintenant besoin d'un nouveau processus.
But now we need a new process.
Government to consult and to produce a new plan of chemicals management priorities. This will show Canadians a multi-year plan of assessing substances in the future. It will also describe the activity such as research and monitoring to better support that effort. The bill sets out a new regime for substances of highest risk. These include persistent and bioaccumulative substances, as well as certain carcinogens, mutagens, and substances that are toxic to reproduction. When considering how to manage such substances, the bill requires that priority be given to prohibiting them. The Senate made improvements to these provisions. In my view, modest changes to the Senate amendments would make this regime even more effective. I think we can all agree on the importance of acting quickly in assessing and managing those risks. CEPA already prescribes timelines, often referred to as CEPA time clock. The government must propose a risk management instrument within 2 years after the substance has been proposed for addition to Schedule 1 and finalize that instrument within a further 18 months. Bill S5 proposes to go further and add a requirement for the government to communicate the timelines for subsequent risk management instruments. The bill also adds a watch list as a tool to improve transparency by consolidating a list of substances whose inherent properties are of concern, but whose current use does not pose a risk that needs to be managed. There will be consultation on the criteria for adding and removing substances as this work will begin once the bill is in force.
And on the issue of transparency, there's been a lot of discussion on the commercial privileged information. This bill will increase the demand to improve transparency, but we have to find a good balance between transparency and the protection of commercial interests in Canada, which this bill does accomplish.
Now includes substantive requirements to accelerate efforts to replace, reduce, and refine animal testing. The 3 Rs are ordered to reflect that the priority is to replace animal testing with the aim of eliminating it as soon as feasible and that scientifically justified alternative methods are available. The government is committed to promoting non-animal test methods and will engage with stakeholders and experts to provide advice on this issue.
This law has not been modified in any essential way over 20 years. This will not be our last attempt to streamline and modernize the law. The government will undertake a number of other activities to deal with the issues here, including other than the parallel reform. Over the past year, we've launched 2 consultations how we could improve transparency in the supply chain. Consultations ended earlier this fall and contributed to the release last month of a notice of intent regarding the labeling of toxic substances in commuter goods. The results of these 2 initiatives will feed into a broader strategy, which we'll publish next year.
Transparency of assessments of new living organisms. As such, the Government of Canada has launched consultations in October 2022. These consultations will examine how the new substances notification regulations could make the risk assessment and regulatory decision-making process more transparent, while encouraging the development of biotechnology innovations that benefit Canadians. The Senate made amendments creating a requirement to determine the need for a new organism. This proposed approach would be near impossible to implement. The results of these consultations will feed into our improvements to the regime for new organism and our government's approach to labeling. Nevertheless, I understand that these are matters of interest to you, and I will listen to your deliberations to inform the regulatory actions that will follow our consultations. I call on you to maintain the enabling and risk-based nature of the legislation that has made Canada a leader in chemical management in the world. Chers députés, je compte sur...
Honourable members, I'm counting on your support so that this bill becomes a law in order to provide the government with the necessary tools to better protect the health and environment of all Canadians. And we won't stop there.
Adopté.
Once this bill is passed, we'll begin regulatory and implementation initiatives, including the development of a framework for the right to a healthy environment and the substances plan of priorities with the highest risk substances regulations, as well as looking at other possible legislation changes to CEPA and ensure that they remain relevant to today's challenges. Thank you very much. And I'd like to point out that we have with us today as well the Department of Health, Mr. Greg Carreau, from the Department of Environment, Mr. John Moffat, we know him well, Laura Farquharson, we have her as a frequent guest, and Jacqueline Gonçalves, another frequent flyer at our committee. Now I'd like to turn to Mr. Deltel to start the first round. Thank you very much, Chair, and welcome to all our colleagues and those who are with us virtually. I apologize for the 3 minutes of delay that I caused because of technical problems. I'd like to, first of all, greet the Minister. It's the first time we have the opportunity to talk with him directly on this in this format. I take the privilege of being named critic, phantom critic, as you say in English, for environment and climate change, and I'm quite honored by this honor and this opportunity to discuss with the Minister. We know him very well in Quebec for very good reasons. He's had a very active participation. He's an activist, and that's not a pejorative. He has been an activist, a defender in environmental questions. Someone who is so active in the civil society has made the jump to politics, and it's a gain for us all. So as we'd say, you got to walk the talk. So we've had a lot of that in the last few months, a situation which for us was the correct way of approaching things. The Minister gave us the green light to a number of projects which put him perhaps in a conflictual situation with some of his former colleagues and current colleagues. But it was a good thing to do for Canada, and we would like to thank him and recognize him for that. Other decisions, of course, we will have some concerns. We'll have an opportunity to discuss them in the future months. But let's stick to the bill here, Bill S5. I'd like to assure the Minister that the Conservatives are in favor of the bill. In principle, we have to live in a clean environment. But as many have noted, there are many, many amendments that have been proposed by senators. In general, some of them were quite minor. We can live with it. But some of them, there's 9 that concern us particularly, and I'd like to exchange with the Minister on that. Fundamentally, we are concerned that there is, in fact, a overlap in the responsibilities, red tape, in other words. And there'll be situations which are more ambiguous and not clear enough. So first, I'd like to draw your attention to Amendment number 10, a new name, and vulnerable environment. It's very difficult from our point of view to define what is vulnerable and what is not vulnerable. For some people, everything is vulnerable. For others, it's a rough shot, not necessary. Now, adding the word to Amendment 10, this casts a cloud of obscurity on this. I'd like to hear the minister's response to that. Well, thank you very much, Honourable Member. First, for your very kind words. It's a pleasure to be working with you and having you as the official critic. A quick response to your question. This issue of vulnerable environment is a notion which is, yes, difficult to define, but vulnerable population, less so. And in scientific literature, of course, there is a matter of being exposed to various products, chemicals, and other. And certain populations in Canada or elsewhere are, for geographic, socioeconomic reasons, are exposed to a higher degree than other parts of the population. So it's quite clear that we can distinguish these populations between an vulnerable environment and vulnerable population. I would have to agree with you that it's a very tough job to define vulnerable environment, but the vulnerable population is quite easy to determine. Yes, but the problem we have here, it's that the industrial sector will have to deal with that. Who is going to decide on their behalf what is vulnerable environment and what is not? And they'll try to find the right balance, of course, but that's what happens if you have a word or an expression, a turn of phrase that is poorly defined or hard to define. When we can't decide if it is or isn't vulnerable, the industry is caught between a conundrum, because we have very high standards that we want to maintain, environmentally speaking, but if we slow down the process of what we do or don't do in Canada, others may do so without much less concern, just dealing with vulnerable populations alone. So why not go that way? Well, the concept in terms of environmental assessment and environmental health towards vulnerable populations is becoming clearer and clearer in the scientific literature and risk evaluation and risk analysis concept framework. We've tried to develop our framework for risk analysis, risk-based analysis, to render it more transparent, more predictable. You've mentioned the Béthenard project, for example, earlier. It was not an easy project for me to deal with personally. Professionally, it was a hard decision as well. But the decision was taken within the timelines allowed by law. And I believe that we can, in fact, chew and walk gum at the same time, and maybe even text at the same time. So the introduction of this vulnerable population, I don't think, should blur the process that's ongoing for some of these projects. Well, other amendments, 17 and 18 from the Senate, live animals. You will have to consult, you as a minister, with the industry. Well, if that's not redundant, I don't know. You'll be repeating the same thing to the industry as what we find already spoken by the Senate. So why? Well, we're currently studying a number of these amendments which were put forth by the Senate. And in many cases, we're fairly comfortable with some of them, and some we would need to change somewhat to make them more easy to become operational. We want to make sure that there's no redundancies or overlap of bureaucratic processes to make it too much paper burden for the sector. As you well said, the process has to be robust, rigorous. I'm going to have to stop you there, honorable colleague. I was so interested with Mr. Deltel's presentation that I forgot to stop the clock. So you've gained a few moments there, but Madam Thompson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et bienvenue au ministre au comité. Permettez-moi de commencer par vous poser une question très vaste. En quoi consiste le droit à un environnement sain?
And it is, as I said earlier, it is the first time that we would include this in under Canadian statute, specifically in CEPA. We're not the first jurisdiction in the world to do that, but it's not something that has been done a lot around the world. So we're not the first, but we're certainly amongst the first to do that. I think we could define, the meaning of the right to a healthy environment will be elaborated through the implementation framework. And this framework will be developed within 2 years from the date of royal assent, based on consultation with Canadians, Canadian experts, non-governmental organization, provinces and territories, Indigenous, our Indigenous partners, as well as the private sector. And the implementation framework would set out how the right to a healthy environment would be considered in the administration of the Act. The framework would also elaborate on principles such as environmental justice, meaning avoiding adverse effects that disproportionately affect vulnerable populations. Issues of non-regression, so continuous improvement of environmental protection. And the Senate amendment to Bill C-5 requires that the implementation framework also elaborate on the principle of intergenerational equity, the reasonable limits to which to which the right is subject, and mechanisms to support the protection of this right. So basically, applying the lens of a right to a healthy environment would support and encourage strong environmental and health standards now and going into the future, robust engagement with Canadians, and new thinking about how to protect populations that are particularly vulnerable to environmental and health risk. And as I was telling your colleague, MP Deltel, earlier, as you well know, I mean, the scientific knowledge on these issues is in constant evolution. So I think what we're trying to do is to build in a process where our regulation can evolve as well.
Thank you, Merci. Could you provide more detail on how you enforce this right to a healthy environment?
Yes, thank you for the question. So we already have existing mechanisms under CEPA, which would continue to be available to individuals to address concerns regarding environmental harm. CEPA has a robust regime under Part 2 relating to public participation, investigation of offenses, and environmental protection actions. There are also actions to prevent or compensate loss which could arise from conduct that contravenes the Act, for example, against a defendant causing environmental harm. So the recognition of a right to a healthy environment will establish new lens for decision-making under CEPA, which will ensure that there is a continual progressive improvement in protecting all Canadians and the environment. And the meaning of the right and how it will be considered in administration of the Act will be developed through the consultation, as I said earlier. But we will continue using the mechanisms under CEPA to enforce this right.
Sorry, I had a minute to come off mute. How will CEPA reform help protect vulnerable populations, including racialized communities?
Thank you. So vulnerable population, and including racialized communities, as I said earlier, may be disproportionately exposed to or negatively impacted by harmful substances due to factors such as health status, socioeconomic status, geography, and cultural practices. In order to address these issues, it is important to understand actual exposure from the multiple substances from different sources to which Canadians are exposed to daily. As introduced, Bill S5 proposed amendments to CEPA that would require the government to consider vulnerable populations and cumulative effects when assessing risks where information is available. Senate amendments added a requirement to consider vulnerable environments. Existing information gathering authorities under CEPA would allow the government to obtain information on vulnerable populations and cumulative effects in additional information, if additional information is needed to inform risk assessment. Amendments to CEPA would also require the government to conduct research and biomonitoring, which may relate to vulnerable populations. Research and biomonitoring would facilitate generating additional data on how exposure to harmful substances impacts vulnerable populations.
Thank you. I think I have a couple of minutes left.
No, just about 15 seconds, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Sorry about that. Madame Posey.
Oui. Oui, merci. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le ministre. J'imagine qu'à l'aube de la 15.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. I know that you've got a lot on your plate, and you may not have too much time with us today, so thank you. I'm obviously going to be asking you some questions on the law for a clean environment, safe environment. The United Nations have called for very ambitious measures to be taken to ensure a clean and safe environment. Now, of course, it'll be introduced into the Canadian law, as we're trying to do today. But to put that in the preamble doesn't have quite the same effect as if it were in the body of the law. We have, in Quebec, for example, a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is in the body itself. Now, by putting this right in the preamble, do you think that it is more than what the international community is dealing with here? Well, thank you for your question, Madame Posey. I'm very pleased to be here this afternoon. I do believe yes. As I said in my opening statement, this is a first step in Canadian law. The insertion of this right into Canadian legislation and a right to a safe environment. And be it in the preamble or in the body or the text or an article of the law, as I was saying to Ms. Thompson, all the tools that we currently have under CEPA will still be available to the implementation of this right. So there's nothing, that fact that it's in the preamble, nothing that hinders or takes away from the implementation of the right. Of course, once the bill adopted, we'll allow ourselves 2 years to develop exactly how this will be implemented and become operational. So you have your framework, and then regulations determine the operational nuts and bolts of the situation. And I think that's pretty standard procedure. Well, I apologize, Mr. Minister, but not only for the Bloc Québécois, but other organizations feel that it's a lot weaker to have it in a preamble. In 1991, the Library of Parliament gave us a notion that it would have a quasi-constitutional power or authority. But in S5, Ms. Paul Alec, a specialist on environmental law, dealt with this issue very, very specifically so that it would be quasi-constitutional. That's what we would like it to become. Don't you think that that would have been a more somber, a more serious approach to ensure that there'd be an absolute right, if you wish, to a clean environment or safe environment for the population? There shall be a clear right to to a safe environment once the bill is passed, Madame Posey. All the tools which currently exist under the CEPA will be used to implement, to operationalize that right to a safe environment. There are a number of items in the amendments that we've proposed to ensure that this will be the matter. We were speaking of vulnerable populations a while ago. This is quite a good leap forward in environmental law. But be that as it may, I said it earlier, we're absolutely prepared to examine all the amendments that you and your colleagues are going to propose and put forward. We want it to be the best bill possible. Well, I will have a few amendments to propose, actually. In your first opening remarks, you said that your team is already at work on beginning the reform of the law, and there's some things that are in their preliminary stages. We spoke about that in December 2021. I'm glad to hear it's moving. Now, these things of going through the Senate, for example, was quite interesting. After weeks of study, of hearings, they still criticized, the Senate criticized the speed with which they felt they were forced to work, if you will. They wanted, of course, a rigorous and complete process, but they couldn't understand the current calendar of sessions for the Senate. Prevent Cancer Now, Mr. Quatrier, who appeared as a witness for the Canadian Educators General Directress. You should take the time to make sure it's a thorough job. Now, we're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place because we're getting emails saying we're going too fast. Some people are writing to us. Well, quite frankly, I believe that the Senate heard from a great number of these organizations. You have this list as well as I do, all the various witnesses and groups that participated and appeared before the Senate committees. Well, we have to expect that the timing or the schedule will be perhaps a little bit different in the House of Commons. I'm sorry we have to interrupt you because Ms. Collins now has the floor.
And thanks to the Minister for being here. I would argue that your comments about the robustness of the current enforcement mechanisms in CEPA are incorrect. We clearly need to update CEPA enforcement. But I did want to ask you specifically about labeling hazardous substances in consumer products. And in my opinion, we need mandatory labeling, something that provides information on hazardous substances and products and ensures greater transparency for the right to know for consumers. I also wanted to note that I spoke to the executive director of the Women's Healthy Environment Network, who spoke very persuasively about the need to have specific labeling when products have a disproportionate impact on women and other vulnerable populations. Talcum powder has been linked to ovarian cancer, and yet there's no label warning consumers, especially women and people with ovaries, about the potential and disproportionate harm. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we could improve this bill to ensure mandatory labeling and that we protect consumers.
Thank you for the question, and I think as I said earlier to MP Posey, this is a first iteration of modernization of CEPA we want to do, but there are other amendments we would want to bring forward further down the road. I thought that trying to change everything that needed to be changed after 20 years in one bill would be a very perilous operation. So I think proceeding by stage is more prudent. As you know, we are in the process of, we've held consultations on labeling jointly with Health Canada.
Maybe just because I've got a short amount of time, I did want to ask you about safer substitution. Many Canadians are worried about risk management actions that simply replace one harmful substance with another. Risk management actions should lead to the use of safer or more sustainable alternatives. Don't you think that this bill should prompt a shift from a reactive chemicals management regime to a more proactive model of protection?
I think we're doing just that. But if you have specific amendments you would like to see brought forward on this particular element, myself and the team at Environment and Climate Change Canada will be happy to consider them.
I also wanted to ask about ambient air quality, and you had mentioned it in your statement, but in the legislation, ambient air quality is one of the things that impact vulnerable populations the most. We've heard from First Nations leaders, folks in Chemical Valley about the horrific impacts of exceeding levels of toxic substances in our air. Can you speak to the reason why it wasn't included in this bill?
I think I would disagree with your characterization of the amendments we're proposing. We're proposing for the first time ever to look at vulnerable populations. We're proposing to look at cumulative effects. And as you know, the air quality management system is a collaborative system that was set up in 2012, under which federal, provincial, and territorial governments all agreed to specific roles and responsibilities. So we are operating within this framework, but I think that the amendments that either we as the government or that have been proposed by the Senate will represent significant progress on the issue of air quality and air quality management.
Okay, well, in my mind, reading through it, it isn't very clear whether that is the case. I hope that the implementation framework will clarify that, but in the bill itself, I don't see that. But I did want to also ask about Part 6. Nature Canada has been adamant that unless we change the current rules, that is both the Act and the regulations under it, we're going to see more genetically engineered organisms escaping into the wild. And in their words, quote, "With nature already on the ropes, wild species do not need this new threat to their survival." They have proposed a number of amendments, and I think I want to highlight a couple of them, and one of them is around consultation with Indigenous communities. And given that Canada was the first country to have genetically modified salmon being eaten by consumers, sometimes without their knowledge, and given the importance of salmon to so many First Nations, especially where I live on the West Coast in the Salish Sea, do you agree that we need to update Section 6 to ensure that that kind of consultation is happening, but then also that there is an opportunity for the public to participate in these assessments more broadly?
Well, in fact, consultations are already on the way on the regulatory update regarding this. So we're not waiting for... Just
so the minister knows, the new substance notification regulations does not provide for regulations respecting public involvement in the assessment and decisions allowing the manufacturer, use, or import of new living organisms. So that review won't actually address these concerns.
15 seconds, please.
Sorry, Mr. Chair.
15 seconds, please, Mr.
I disagree with your characterization, and as I said, we are holding consultations, including with Indigenous people on this issue, as well as others. I was talking about labeling a few minutes ago.
Okay, thanks.
So we are looking at many aspects of how we can improve this.
Thank you. Thank you. The minister has a hard stop, so we're going to. I'm going to go to the. Call it the 20% discount on the second round. So 4 minutes and 2 minutes. We'll start with Mr. McLean. Mr. McLean, I think you're on mute.
Merci. Est-ce que tu m'entends maintenant?
Oui.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? Yes, go ahead. Good afternoon, Mr. Minister. This is the very first time that you are appearing before our recently reconstituted Environment and Climate Committee. So my colleagues are here to recognize the efforts that you've been making and to see if they are in agreement with what you're saying.
Here is what you addressed in your opening comments when you talked about the amendments made in the Senate. Now, when you talk about the amendments made in the Senate, how they don't fulfill what's required in the bill, can you give us some examples of what you think we might need to change here quickly in order to make sure this bill works well?
Well, first, merci pour vos commentaires.
Well, thank you for your kind comments in French. And
The first time that I have the pleasure of meeting some of you, it's obviously not my first testimony at the Environment Committee. During my opening remarks, I made a specific reference to some Senate amendments that would propose to create requirements to determine the need for a new organism. That is one example of me and the department having a really difficult time to see how one would ever operationalize something like that. So, as I said earlier, I think that many amendments we agree with. We will want to change some, but that's an example.
We'll get that further. Thank you, Mr. Minister. I'm curious about one thing here. When Clause 9 expands your powers for information gathering power set out under Section 46.1 to include products that contain or may release into the environment a substance that is toxic or capable of becoming toxic. Activities may contribute to pollution, hydraulic fracturing, and tailings ponds. Minister, speaking frankly, you and your government, but you in particular, have made several efforts to move into provincial jurisdiction here. Is this another attempt to move
Rappel au président, monsieur.
Oui, excusez, sorry, we have a point of order, Mr. McLean.
Oui, désolé, c'est que les interprètes comprennent très mal.
Oui, hein, la connexion n'est pas bonne. Hein.
Alors, je ne sais pas si c'est une question d'auteur du micro. Mais...
je pense pas.
Well, there seems to be a problem there with your mic, perhaps. There might be a connection problem. It could be bandwidth, but let's try to carry on and we'll see.
Did you hear my question there?
I did.
Okay, so it's Clause 9 and this bill's attempt to move into regulating hydraulic fracturing and tailings ponds, which I don't think your department is involved with at this point in time. Is it another attempt to regulate into provincial jurisdiction like you've demonstrated in other manners?
I would disagree with your characterization of our actions. In fact, the Supreme Court, when it came to carbon pricing...
Sorry, it's not a characterization, it's a question.
Well, there was a characterization, then there was a question. So I disagree with your characterization. As you know, environment is a shared jurisdiction, and no, it's not an attempt to try and impede on provincial jurisdictions. The federal government has a recognized jurisdiction when it comes to issues such as water quality, for example.
Okay, thank you. Do I have a little more time here, just because of the interruption there, Mr. Chair?
Oh, I did stop it when we were having. Anyway, okay. Go ahead. Just keep going, and I'll,
yeah. I know that some of the other some of my colleagues talked about the definitions here on what we're talking about: environmental equity, environmental justice. But we also talk about harm versus benefit here when we talk about intergenerational equity. Is this balance going to be there as far as what contributes to benefit going forward and contributes to harm? I mean, I know it is two sides of the same ledger. And are we going to provide these definitions for judges ahead of time, or are we going to leave it open for somebody?
Briefly, please, Minister, maybe 10, 15 seconds. Yeah. Whatever you can do in 10, 15 seconds. Yeah.
That's a really good question. And as a legislator, the issue of balance is a really important one. Just earlier this week, I approved a mining project for palladium, which will have significant local impacts, but will generate benefits down the road because it will help us to electrify many of our industries. So Very good question.
We'll have to go to Ms. Taylor-Roy now. We don't have to. It's with pleasure that we go to Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, for that. And bonjour à la ministre et merci.
Good afternoon to the minister, and thank you for attending today and to meet with us and answer some questions. I would also like to thank you for your leadership in the field of environmental areas.
Again, I'm just going to stop for a second. Are we looking into that problem? Is that what? Yeah, just if we'll just pause for 2 seconds while we look into the internet connection issue. Properly, we'll stop again. Sorry about that, Ms. No, it's not that. It's an internet connection issue. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so I'll continue in English because my French is probably more difficult to hear with a bad internet connection. But I also, you talked a lot about the new plan of chemicals management, how that's a priority and what's happening with that. But before I get to my question, I also want to thank you and your department for the leadership on reducing the need for animal testing and trying to make progress in that area. I think it's very important, and I'm very grateful. But my question is to do with the assessment and reassessment of chemicals. Now, I'm assuming they're covered under the higher standards of Bill S5, but I just would like you to comment on whether they are or not, and what specific benefits you see coming from that, improved, if you will, chemical management plan.
Well, thank you for your kind words, and thank you for the question, the important question. So one of the proposed changes in this bill relates to the modernization of the management of chemicals and other substances. And I don't tend to use the word leader lightly, but I think that, as I said earlier, we are recognized when it comes to management of chemicals as a world leader. And in fact, I often have meetings with some of my peers in different countries who want to learn from Canada's experience. So we've completed, as I said earlier, 98.5% of the more than 4,600 substances that were identified. So, and I'm pleased to confirm that the reassessments will also be held to this level of stringency in the evaluation process going forward. Once S5 is adopted. So it's a clear environmental benefit for Canadians by ensuring that chemicals that are assessed under the Act will be held to the highest environmental standards, both when they were originally assessed and when they are reassessed. This is clearly progress.
Yes, yeah, thank you. And I think I have a few minutes, so just a quick question. there's been a discussion about the involvement of Indigenous people in the process and what's happening, but I'm just wondering, how does strengthening SEPA enhance reconciliation and environmental and health protection for Indigenous peoples and communities?
That's a good question. Also, I think we are trying to fundamentally change the way we do things in Canada when it comes to our relationship with Indigenous people, whether it is to include Indigenous knowledge in an impact assessment. Now, that's done by the Canadian Impact Assessment Agency. Whether it is to develop our international priorities, going to meetings like COP27 or COP15. So I think this is another in a number of different attempts to reconciliation by ensuring that the concerns and priorities of Indigenous people are taken into account in the elaboration of the modernization of SEPA, but also in its implementation.
Okay, thank you. The time's up, so we'll go to Madame Posé for 2 minutes.
Oui, merci. Alors,
yes, thank you. Mr. Minister, I'd like to come back to my previous question, if I will. I'd like to talk about the timetable. This timetable is that of our elected people. We have our calendar of activity here. Well, look. 25th of October, notice of intent for labeling issues, and offered Canadians to respond by the 12th of January. A consultation occurred or will occur on new substances, new products, pesticides, for example. We're going to get the results of that on the 5th of December. 5th, we have to put in our amendments by the 6th of December. How can you justify this tight operating calendar for people who perhaps are not expert in the field? What would you say about that? Well, 2 comments. We've spent more time in the House on second reading on this bill than on the adoption of a budget, which I think is quite telling. We gave the MPs ample time to express themselves on that. And then you're talking about we're going too fast on consultations. We can't win. It's a no-win situation here. It's either too fast or too slow. I mean, we can't win. And for the number of people who are telling you they're going too fast, I get a number of letters and calls and emails where it's too slow. No, but your consultation dates will occur after when the elected people, the House, has already concluded or made a decision on something. So how can you consult retroactively? We're under a great deal of pressure that this bill be adopted as quickly as possible so that we can implement it.
I just wanted to follow up on the conversation we were having at the end of my time last time, just reminding the minister that a regulation cannot do what its authorizing statute does not allow. So Section 114 of SEPA would be what allows for public consultation. But I would also echo Nature Canada's comments that the government should not be using a review of the regulations for which they have had 23 years to undertake to postpone action in the Act when it's finally before Parliament. I did also want to ask about confidential business information, and I'm curious why there is not a presumption of non-confidentiality and why the government isn't requiring some kind of audit when companies are requesting confidential business information.
Vous êtes en sourdine, Monsieur.
My apologies, merci, Monsieur le Président. Maybe on the first part of your question, perhaps I can turn to John or Laura if you want any more.
We will have time with the officials after, so I'd love to hear from you if.
So, as I said earlier, I don't think that what we're proposing in S5 will help us to update everything that needs to be updated on under SEPA. But I think that what the amendment, if you'll allow me, the amendments that are being proposed are significant progress.
Okay, thank you. I would like to ask about timelines because I've only got 30 seconds left. Many stakeholders have been asking for strict timelines for priority planning, public requests for assessment, and toxic substance assessments. I'm curious if the minister would support those kind of amendments.
Please bring those amendment forwards. The team and I will be happy to look at them with you.
Thank you. Mr. Couric.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for coming before the Environment Committee. And likewise, it's the first chance that I've had to be engaged in this way since being appointed to the committee. Regarding some of the Section 9 specifically and the possible effects that could be had on some oil field activities like hydraulic fracturing and whatnot, can you provide some comment on as to whether or not that is something that's specified in this bill?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
So the chemicals related with what's known as fracking in the oil patch, is there an effect in Section 9 of this bill related to how those substances would be classified?
So you're asking if the amendments that are being proposed would have an impact specifically on chemicals that are used for hydraulic fracturing. Is that your question?
Yes.
As you know, the chemical management, the proposed reform that are in S5 would help us to identify chemicals and assess them. But maybe for the sake of giving you a clearer answer, I could turn to perhaps John or Laura on this.
Okay, I'll be sure to ask that question in the follow-up round. Minister, you talked in your opening statement about the risk versus hazard based approach, and certainly we've heard from a number of witnesses to make sure that we keep that strong risk-based approach. Can you provide further comment as to if any of the amendments particularly move away from the risk and towards hazard, and why they may be problematic?
Problematic in what sense? Because the SEPA, does take a risk management approach to many of these issues, but it's not exclusively a risk management approach. And as you may recall, when the bill was introduced, it was saluted both by industry and environmental groups alike.
Yeah, thanks. And just to acknowledge, I know that former Environment Minister Leona Aglukkaq under the Harper years had actually done quite a bit of work, I think, in terms of some of the initial work that both you and your predecessors had inherited. Now, I do want to ask something that is so sorry.
I'm not familiar with her work on this.
Okay. She was a great minister, I can assure you of that.
I know.
Minister, we heard from specifically stakeholders within the agricultural community about some of the other acts related to pharmaceuticals and agriculture, food and safety that really take guidance from SEPA. I'm wondering if you can provide comment as to if internally the work put into the background of this bill has included ensuring that the wide sweeping effects that are somewhat indirectly related to impacts have been included in the drafting of this legislation.
One would have to define what you mean by wide sweeping effects, but I can assure you that we've worked on the proposed bill with many different departments, including health, including agriculture, including a number of government departments. And in fact, we have some of those colleagues on the line here with us.
Pretty much out of time, yeah. Mr. Longfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Minister for being with us and for hanging on for a few minutes with us. I think it is important that we maintain the risk-based approach to our decision-making and keeping science as a foundation of what we're working on. You mentioned in your comments about avoiding the call for a demonstrable need for new living organisms. I think of the work that the University of Guelph does in research using CRISPR technology and other gene editing platforms to improve life through genetic streams. The antimicrobial CRISPR-Cas system that they're using is an example of trying to improve life of animals and defending against antimicrobial resistance in their genes, as well as we consume animals during as we're eating. So looking at this and the complexity, and also some of what Ms. Collins brought forward, how is the government addressing the issues relating to genetically modified organisms?
Thank you so much for the question, MP Longfield. So Part 6 of CEPA provides a framework to regulate the assessment and management of new living organisms, which include a genetically modified organism. As you know, on October 13th of this year, Environment and Climate Change Canada and Health Canada launched consultations to help determine how the new substance notification regulation for organisms can better protect human health and environment through increased openness and transparency in both risk assessment as well as regulatory decision-making process. In face of what is clearly a rapidly evolving biotechnology sector, I think that the public engagement process will really help to modernize the regulation and encourage innovation in the biotech sector, while we ensure that human health and the environment are protected from harmful substances. And that's this balance that we try to strike in Section 6 or in the overall CEPA amendments that we're proposing.
Thanks. And it'll be interesting to see how that public engagement process rolls out. And I know there will be a lot of attention on that pertaining to CEPA. We've also heard about testimony creating a second list of items of concern with no actions associated with these items, that so-called watch list, and how the connections to other parts of the Act create some redundancies. I'm wondering about this watch list. You mentioned it in your speech. Could you expand on how that list is going to be managed?
Yes, thank you. So currently, departments publicly explain findings related to substances of potential concern, hazards associated with the substance, for example, and track any follow-up actions taken on that substance. However, there is no easy-to-access public list of substances of potential concern that consolidates the follow-up actions for these substances. So the watch list is intended to address this information and transparency gap. The watch list will increase transparency and facilitate informed substitution by clearly communicating to stakeholders and Canadians, generally speaking, that substance that could meet the CEPA toxic criteria in the future. For example, if new use of the substance emerge, or if the potential for exposure increases. So it will allow for stakeholders and the public to make informed decisions regarding which substances they may choose to avoid.
Thank you. I think we're going to have to more or less stop there. So thank you, Minister, for making the time today and even giving us a little bit of extra time. We appreciate that. And we'll see you again in future, no doubt.
Merci,
Monsieur le Ministre. Nous allons,
Thank you, Mr. Minister. We're going to take a very short brief pause here, and we'll continue with our second half of the meeting today. We'll have the opportunity to ask questions of the officials. Thank you.
Question, the ministry representatives. We'll start with Mr. Benson for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here today. That was a really good hour with the minister, and he answered a lot of the questions and answered a lot of the questions that I was going to ask. So I think I'll ask him again a little bit to see how the ministers or the witnesses here can elaborate a little bit more on it. But let's start with the watch list. Can you just briefly explain how new substances are put onto the watch list?
I don't know who that's for, but
I guess it's for anybody.
Whoever wants to jump in.
Well, perhaps I'll go. I thought maybe John is not available right now, so I can start. So the watch list is one of the options at the end of having assessed a substance to determine whether there's harm to the environment or human health. If there are 4 options after that, it can be put on Schedule 1, and one of the options in there is that it could be put on the watch list. So the idea there is after, this would be one of the ways the watch list would be used, if after assessment, there are determined to be the properties of the substance are hazardous, but the exposure, for example, is such that there is no risk at this time, such that it would be put on Schedule 1 to be managed formally, then that could be put on the watch list. And that would be, the watch list is a consolidated list of substances, basically giving the notice that these substances are not toxic at this time, but may be reassessed and be found to be toxic if, for example, exposure changes.
Now, in the future, after some research was done and new data was collected, is there going to be an off-ramp that some of these substances could be removed from the watch list and we would not be a concern anymore?
Yes, I think that would be the idea. We would keep that list current. If, for example, the substance were reassessed and was put on Schedule 1, you would take it off the watch list. If it were also reassessed and found not to be of concern, I'm not sure that happens, but yes, then it would come off the watch list too. But policy will be developed to be clear about the criteria.
The minister was talking about how we've looked at 98% of the chemicals, substances, and we're almost 100%. It seems that process has been taking a long time. It's very slow. So the changes we're making now to have this Schedule 1 into 2 parts, is this new process going to be an improvement over our existing system of how we do it?
Actually, maybe I can answer that, and apologies. I think I turned my video and sound onto a different system for the first question. Apologies. So I'm John Moffat, the ADM of the Environmental Protection Branch at Environment and Climate Change Canada. 2 parts to your question. One with respect to the 98%, and the second with respect to what are we improving. So first of all, in fact, we're not slow. We are the fastest country in the world with respect to having assessed all of the substances in commerce in the 1980s. No other country has come close to our record. So what we did was we looked at all of the substances in commerce and said, we don't have a regime to say you can't use until you prove safe because they're already here. So what are we going to do? Every country in the world has kind of wrestled with the same issue. As I said, we have moved farther, faster than any other country in reviewing that stock of substances, notwithstanding the fact that we are almost all the way through that list. we recognize, however, that the job is not done, not just because we have a small number of those substances left, but because, of course, there are lots of new substances being introduced and developed all the time. Some of them are being introduced and used in different manners. We also know, as a result of evolving science, that substances can have different impacts in synergistic impacts when they're used together, when they're combined with other substances in the atmosphere or in the body and in products. And so we are now moving toward that more complex kind of science, type of science, where we're not just looking at individual substances, but at combination of substances and at different uses of substances. We're also, as the minister explained, putting much more emphasis on not just kind of generic impacts, but on impacts across Canada and across different populations and peoples, so that we pay close attention to the most vulnerable members of society.
Thank you for that answer. And I apologize if I meant slow. It sounds like we're very fast compared to other countries. I was only sort of thinking about slow in the sense that, you know, we have a lot of chemicals we're using, and, you know, if it takes a long time to assess that, there could be damage done because we haven't assessed it sooner. I just meant that in a general sense, that we want to get it.
Yeah, we'll stop on that note, on that clarification. Mr. Weiler for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, et j'apprécie.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I appreciate that the officials are here to answer questions and for their expertise and the important work that they do.
I'd like to ask is related to timelines, and so this question might be for Ms. Gonsalves. So I understand from speaking with many stakeholders that they are concerned about the delta between when preliminary risk assessments are completed and when final risk assessments are completed. So I was hoping you could explain to this committee what some of the reasons are that these risk assessments typically get delayed, and what it would take to ensure that these final assessments are done in a consistently timely way.
Thank you for the question. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
So thank you for the question. As many of you know, the development of risk assessments is a very data-intensive type of process. And of course, we do all assessments in collaboration with our colleagues at Health Canada. And so examining health and environmental data to determine risk takes time. When we do publish a draft, there are times when the public consultation period on those draft assessments delivers new information to us, sometimes new data, new studies, information that we need to consider. And so depending on those, the feedback that we receive from the public, there may be times when we have to re-examine how we've conducted our exposure models and things of that nature. There are also situations where sometimes other jurisdictions are also conducting similar studies or assessments on similar substances. And sometimes we need to consider that new information that's being generated in those other jurisdictions before we can finalize our assessments to ensure that we've done a complete enough study of the subject before we conclude. And so there are a number of different reasons why sometimes the time frame between the draft and the final assessment can take some time. I hope that answered your question.
That definitely, thank you very much for the answer, and that certainly answers the first part of the question. But maybe if you could explain from your experience and expertise in this space, what would be a reasonable time to expect from a preliminary assessment being completed to when a final risk assessment is completed?
So generally, when there are very few comments between the draft and the final, it doesn't, the period can be reasonable, sort of within 18 months to 2 years to finalize something. But when we do receive additional information and we do have to conduct perhaps additional information gathering, it can take quite a bit of time. So it really is dependent on the particular situation.
Great. Thank you very much. That's quite helpful. Next question I have will be actually to Ms. Farquharson. So in Bill S5, Clause 58 of Bill S5, rather, removes the list of toxic substances from the title of Schedule 1. We've heard conflicting testimony on the impact of this. And so I'm curious, is Environment and Climate Change Canada confident, based on the legal advice that it has received, that the removal of the title, the list of toxic substances, will not impact the constitutionality of CEPA as a criminal law power?
Yes, I mean, the quick answer is the government's satisfied that the bill is constitutional.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. So next question I have is that S5 proposes changes to the planning process for priority substances to assess whether or not that they're going to be toxic. And so again, this may be a question for Ms. Gonsalves. There is an interest to ensure that this is done in a timely way. So I'm wondering if introducing timelines for these chemicals to be assessed would pose a significant challenge for the ministry.
Maybe I can jump in. Sorry, Jackie, and then we can turn to Jackie and Greg. First of all, it's probably important to recognize the context here. So I described in response to a previous question that about close to 15 years ago, we developed a plan to look at the many thousands of substances that had been in commerce in the 1980s and that had not gone through the new substances regime. That plan was a strictly policy-based plan. We published timelines for 5 years out, and then repeated those every 5 years. What we're now saying in this bill is, because we're moving forward into a different regime, looking at different substances from different perspectives, let's have a provision in the law that requires ministers to publish a plan. They will be required to publish that plan within 2 years of the bill being passed, and then they'll be required to report on its implementation and to renew it from time to time. So there will be kind of a very clear obligation to have a plan. That plan will need to include expectations and timelines. That said, coming back to Ms. Gonsalves' earlier point, it is the government's view that it would not be appropriate to prescribe timelines that would apply to every risk assessment, given the wide range of complexity associated with each different assessment.
Okay, we're going to have to stop there and go to Mme Posé.
Oui, alors, merci.
Yes, thanks again. I'd like to join with my colleagues to say thank you to all the officials that are here today on a Friday afternoon. Now, the question is not addressed to any individual witness, but it's a question that I asked the minister earlier concerning consultation and on the new biotechnological process of substances. I'd like to get back to labeling of toxic materials. Canadians should know what's in the product that they're buying and they're using on a day-by-day basis or use at work, particularly if this might have impact on the environment or on health. Now, what's more interesting still, I think people should be able to participate up until the 12th of January. But it says, at the close of consultation, there will be the publication of a strategy to ensure the transparency of the supply chain and the labeling of substances, including measures to improve access to information on chemical substances for the benefit of consumers from the government. These members might include rules, regulations, or laws, as well as processes and procedures. So the content of this deals with the bill before us. So there's a bit of an overlap here, an overlay, if you will, environment and what we're looking at here. How can we get information from the public until the 12th of January, when we're going to finalize this, perhaps even before Christmas? I'm going to ask you that again, but I'm going to do it in writing as well. When will this be published? To go forward quietly and calmly when S5 is I don't know if that's very responsible. So could you clarify the consultative process and the timelines involved? Because you have to respect people that you consult, and you have to, of course, recognize everyone who has put input into S5. We've heard from witnesses who are going through deregulation into the industry. We can brag all we want about Canadian legislation or leadership and compared to the Europeans, but the generic approach about the REACH in Europe was reported in Le Monde. A major evolution which will allow the introduction of prohibitions on groups of substances without having to show any unacceptable reason for individual substances. 140 organizations in the European Union feel that between 4,000 to 7,000 possible substances will be prohibited in the next few years. Now, there's a big move afoot to ban substances which might be damaging to the environment or to health. Why was this approach not taken here in Canada?
Again, maybe I can start. I think there are essentially two questions there. One is with respect to labeling, and the other is with respect to what we would call a class approach. We think that there is no contradiction between the consultation process that's underway on labeling and the amendments to the bill, because CEPA actually already authorizes the use of the imposition of labeling requirements. And indeed, we have already imposed labeling requirements with respect to various substances in various products. So the real issue is, in what circumstances should we require labeling going forward? For what substances, in what products? Can we be more
Je m'excuse, je vais vous arrêter parce que je vois...
I'd like to interrupt you here because I'd rather hear you on the question of what is going on in comparison to the European Union.
Okay, so the basic question there is, the assertion is that in Europe, under REACH, there will be the ability to take action on broad classes of substances. Again, we already have that authority in CEPA, and we've just issued, for example, a description about a proposed approach for perfluorocarbonated substances. My colleagues can provide you with more detail, but we've been very clear that this approach will enable us to address potentially thousands of substances at one time.
Donc, vous dites que ça...
So this will allow, we're talking about the future. It's not currently the case in Canada, if I understood you correctly. Since the 80s,
it already is. We already have that authority, and we're taking that action now.
Parce que, c'est que depuis les années...
Well, since the 80s, you're really capable of saying that we're on top of the assessment. Don't you think we're a little bit behind?
So the traditional approach in Canada has been primarily substance by substance, but that has not always been the case. Some of the earliest assessments were of effluent from pulp and paper, effluent from metal mining, for example, which comprise multiple substances, so we've always had that authority. As I explained in response to an earlier question, we are now moving from a situation where we committed to look at 4,300 individual substances to a situation where we will increasingly look at combinations of substances or classes of substances.
Thank you. Ms. Collins.
Using existing authorities.
Ms. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the officials who have been working on this. This is a large bill, and it has already gone through the Senate, and I know that you folks have been working really hard. I do have a number of questions, and the first one is on the right to a healthy environment. This is a historic and important development in Canada, and it's one of the reasons why it's so important that we get this right. We've heard from stakeholders, we've heard from a number of witnesses who appreciate the Senate's amendment that fixed some of the problematic language in the original formulation, but there's a similar change that's needed to the requirements for the implementation framework. And I'd love to hear comments from the witnesses. In particular, these witnesses are arguing that legislation should not presuppose that consideration of social, health, scientific, and economic factors will always justify limiting the right.
Again, I'll start, but Laura, maybe you can jump in. And so it's our opinion that the language in the Act, and we're certainly looking forward to the discussion in committee, but that the language in the Act does not specify that those factors must always be taken into account, and indeed the provision does not stipulate that those factors will always trump, perhaps an inappropriate use of words, but will always supersede the right to a healthy environment. What the language does is it enables decision makers to take those factors into account.
And I had asked the minister about ambient air quality, and we've heard from witnesses who are recommending an explicit requirement for the implementation framework to specify how the government's going to uphold this right in relation to ambient air quality standards as well as to substance assessments. They argue that this would provide a measure of certainty in the law that the framework will address these two critical pieces that have potentially the greatest potential of saving lives.
So the Act is, so the bill is very clear that the right applies to the entire Act. So it applies, it as written, it currently applies to every decision taken under the Act. One of the potential downsides to listing one or two of the many decisions that are taken on a regular basis under the Act is the possibility of an unintended legal interpretation that, in fact, the right or the Implementation Act only applies in those areas. So again, look forward to discussing this further. We absolutely expect and intend the implementation framework to include discussion of issues including air pollution, but again, there's some sort of legislative considerations associated with specifically identifying some but not all of the many decisions that need to be addressed in the implementation framework.
And you spoke a bit already about timelines. We've heard from witnesses specifically around priority planning under Clause 19. That it's very similar to the chemical management plan, but there's no requirement within priority planning to set timelines and to update the plan. Can you speak to why that's the case, if it would be beneficial to require timelines and plan updates to ensure that the plan remains current and is updated at least every 5 years, ideally?
I think we certainly see a benefit in having the plan outline expected timelines for broad categories of activities, and also to provide an expected time frame within which it might need to be the overall plan might need to be revisited and renewed. I think the main concern that we have is with respect to any obligation to specify timelines for discrete activities such as an individual risk assessment.
I also asked the minister about confidential business information and the idea of the presumption of non-confidentiality and the potential of having audits to ensure that these requests that companies are putting in are actually they have justifiable rationale for making this information confidential. I'd love to hear from the witnesses.
Laura, can you address that, please?
Yeah, for sure. So under CEPA, if there's a need to release confidential business information, the claim is scrutinized, and if it needs to be released, it will be released if it's in the public interest to do so. And in terms of requiring scrutiny of reversing the presumption, I think we have to separate. It wouldn't make sense in a lot of situations. The department receives a lot of confidential business information, and not all of it is published right away. So we wouldn't want a process that at the beginning requires us to set up some kind of bureaucracy to examine every single claim.
What about the idea of auditing a certain portion?
Sorry, and if we could all stay back from the microphones, that would, I think, be appreciated by the interpreters, but we're out of time. And we'll go to Mr. Deltel for 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you, Chair. And congratulations and thanks, of course, to the officials for their presentation and their answers to our questions. I'd like to say, Mr. Chair, I've had a lot of respect for all of these officials who come and appear before committees. Their task is, of course, to explain and in front of a very multi-partisan audience here what's going on. So I would like to thank you, and I'd like to, thank all government public servant employees. You do your work with dignity and devotion.
Some concern that we have about the duplication, the red tape, and also the lack of clarity of certain amendments tabled by the senators. Alors, à messieurs, dames, qui sont...
So, ladies and gentlemen who are before us, I'd like to ask you a few questions that I asked earlier to the Minister concerning certain amendments proposed by the Senate. If you take a look, when we talk about vulnerable environment, from your knowledge, do you think that term should be explained, better defined, detailed, so that it stays rather vague and ambiguous? Because what is, in fact, a vulnerable environment?
Thank you for raising that question. And indeed, I think you'll see that that we are on record in the Senate as explaining that this term would be a novel term that would require definition. If not, I think it's our view that it would be difficult to define because it's a new term. It might be difficult to define in legislation because it may be a term that needs to be evolve over time. But it would certainly need some policy work so that Canadians and companies affected by the legislation and activities undertaken under the Act would have some certainty and predictability about how we would use the term. So again, I think the easy answer is that we look forward to further discussion of the term and the appropriateness of including that term in the bill itself.
So when you talk about further discussion, well, we're talking about adopting or not adopting this bill as soon as possible, as the minister said. So do you think that we have the time frame necessary to clarify it, or is it too late and we shall put it aside?
I think I need to defer to the chair on questions about timing that the committee has available to it. I apologize.
I think that was maybe more of a rhetorical question, Mr. Delta.
I quote the minister who said would like to see it sooner. Then sooner is better. That's my thought of his testimony. I would like to address another issue now when we talk about amendments 17 and 18. Dans cet amendement-là, les sénateurs...
In those amendments, the senators would hope that the consultations be conducted by the minister and by the industry. So I think that is a bit redundant. So what do you think?
I apologize. I did not understand the question.
Bien. Oui, les amendements.
Well, 17 and 18, the amendments, they were looking at building new consultations with each living organism created in Canada. But should this be done first by the department and then by the private sector, the industry? In my mind, that's two consultations. One might not suffice, do you think? Would they be required by law, or would save a lot of time and be more efficient?
Our overall view on the approach to living organisms is that we have just launched a broad-reaching discussion on the overall approach to assessing and managing living organisms. We have broad authority in the CEPA, so let's not jump straight to legislative fixes. Let's talk to Canadians and experts about the current regime, whether there are improvements or changes to the current regime, and what those are, whether they're policy, regulatory, or legislative.
Ms. Thompson, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the officials. Mr. Moffat, if I could begin with you. How does strengthening CEPA address the recommendations of past parliamentary committees?
That's a very important question. So this bill clearly addresses some of the recommendations of previous committees. As the minister explained, it has two focuses: one, in introducing the right to a healthy environment, and two, improvements to the provisions related to the management of chemicals in Canada. We fully acknowledge that committees identified areas for improvement in other parts of the bill. The government has been clear from the first introduction of the bill that this bill does not address those, not because the government is disinterested in those, but because the government chose to introduce a relatively small, manageable package, and the government has also expressed its intention to follow up this package with additional sets of amendments in the future. I think it'll be incumbent on us to package those so that they're sort of thematically based and can be discussed and debated and considered as such. So there's no pretense that this is the full sum of amendments that the government supports or that are needed, but these are important and can be addressed now.
Thank you. And I'm not sure, Mr. Moffat, if you're the best one to answer this, or Mr. Coreau, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but it's just to briefly speak to Food and Drug Act, what it is, and then why is it being amended, just to capture that for the record. Thank you.
Greg?
Thank you very much for the question. And the amendments proposed in S5 around the Food and Drugs Act reconcile the current regime where assessments are being done under both the Food and Drugs Act for pharmaceuticals and certain chemicals, and also under CEPA for the environmental assessment. So the proposal is to reconcile the potential duplication to enable the full assessment, both from human health and environmental considerations under the Food and Drugs Act, and that will result in efficiencies for both industry and the government.
Thank you. And actually, this is a question for both Department of Health, through Mr. Coreau, and also the environment. We have heard as a committee some concerns from witnesses on whether there's sufficient internal resources to be able to implement what's in this bill. Could you speak to that from your departmental lens and really around staffing, triaging, resources needed to be able to ensure that what is contained in this bill is able to be implemented in a timely and efficient, effective manner? Thank you.
So this is an ongoing issue for the management of all departments, including environment and health. The amendments in the Act are largely, not exclusively, but largely enabling. There are some new mandatory requirements, such as the requirement to develop a plan for chemicals management and an implementation framework for the right. Essentially, what happens is that once legislation is passed, we look internally at our existing resources and develop an assessment of the adequacy of resources, and then, if needed, make an approach to the Department of Finance for new resources. That's something that happens on an ongoing basis, and is certainly something that will happen once this bill gets implemented. At the moment, I don't think we're in a position to give a formal opinion about the need for new resources.
Thank you. We have time for one quick question, Mr. Chair.
You have 25 seconds for a 25-second question, but no answer.
I'll pass. Thank you.
Madame Posé pour 2 minutes et demie.
2 minutes et demie.
2.5? Okay. I have 2.5 minutes, 2 questions. First question. We know that Canada and the United States have approached a risk-based analysis, whereas in Europe it's a danger-based risk analysis. Can you distinguish the difference between these two approaches?
I don't think there's a big difference between the approach that all developed countries take. But what the terms that you will hear as we continue to discuss this bill are risk-based versus hazard-based. A purely hazard-based approach looks at at a substance or a group of substance and says, in the abstract, does the substance have characteristics that could, in some circumstance, pose a harm to the environment or to human health? A risk-based approach starts with the hazard assessment, but then says, how is the substance used? How is it? And based on how it's used, is there an opportunity or a likelihood or actual exposure occurring? If there is no exposure occurring, then there is no risk. And that's a risk-based approach. So it combines the hazardous characteristics of a substance together with its current possible uses.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you for that. My second question is somewhat similar to Laura, my colleague's question. Industry is concerned about confidential business information. Would there not be a way between the public's right to know without encumbering or endangering business confidentiality in Canada?
Si vous parlez des...
Well, if you're talking about commercial confidential information, business information, I think it's important to find a balance between transparency and the protection of this privileged information in order to foster innovation. The law as it stands and the various amendments in this particular bill, I think, has found this balance. Thank you. Madam Collins, 2.5 minutes.
And to Mr. Moffat, you had said in your response to one of the other questions, let's not jump to legislative fixes when it comes to the living organisms, Part 6. And I wouldn't characterize, the government having 23 years to undertake a review of these regulations, kind of a 23-year wait as jumping to legislative fixes. I'm concerned that the government is using this review to avoid fixing this piece of legislation, and I think a lot of stakeholders are worried about this. I'm curious how you respond to the concerns, especially when it comes to public involvement in the assessment and decisions.
Well, I don't want to respond directly to kind of government intentions about hiding or otherwise from public concern. That I can tell you that both departments have collaborated in launching a broad-ranging review of the new substances regime for living organisms. I think it's also important, however, to maybe spend a little bit of time, perhaps not today, but in subsequent meetings, in actually digging into exactly how the living organisms.
I'm sorry, I've only got a minute left. So the new substance notification regulations for organisms doesn't provide for regulations respecting public involvement in the assessment and decisions. A regulation can't do what its authorizing statute does not allow, so it's section 114. And so how wouldn't you agree that we should be fixing the legislation now to allow for that kind of public involvement?
So we do allow for public involvement, and indeed we have current practice does include public involvement.
No, Section 114 doesn't currently grant authority for including these elements in the NSR. Is that not correct?
Well, we do provide for public involvement, and my colleague Jacqueline Gonsalves can explain the current procedures.
We're kind of out of time, but...
Do I have 10 seconds if she wanted to jump in?
Yeah, 10 seconds, but I mean, please hold it to 10 seconds.
All right, so just very quickly, just to reiterate, we do currently, for higher living organisms, allow for a period of public consultation within the time period prescribed for the risk assessment to occur. Thank you.
Mr. Couric for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks to all the officials for joining us here today. We've heard some talk about the watch list, and one of the concerns, and I know that in an answer previously, it was referred to that the classification of substances going on and off of the watch list. However, when looking through the legislation and hearing witness testimony, there is concern that there's not a clearly defined off ramp to this so-called watch list. I'm wondering if I could hear get some clarity around why there's a bit of a disparity, it seems, in understanding.
I think the answer that we gave was that there would, as a matter of policy, we would, we are committed to, and on record as saying that we will develop a policy about how to implement the watch list. That said, as we proceed into clause by clause, I think that there is openness on the part of the government to maybe providing some clarity with regard to authority to add or remove substances from the watch list to address the concern that you identified.
Okay, I appreciate that, because that's where certainly the work that the committee is trying to do is to tighten up some of what could be seen as problematic aspects of the bill. So if there's any further information that any of you could provide, certainly it would be helpful. Could you describe for me some of the characteristics of a substance that would be of the highest risk? And the reason why I ask this is the Senate has provided some defining characteristics of what this would look like, and one of the things that I've heard concern is that if it's defined in the Act, then it provides maybe that as a substance of highest risk, it doesn't necessarily allow the latitude for the experts within your department to ensure that it is defined properly on an ongoing basis. Can you provide some feedback to that?
Again, maybe I can start.
Sure.
I think there's two sets of issues there. One is what kind of issues, what kind of substances would we think about adding to the watch list? And that goes back to the answer that I gave to MP Deltel about the difference between the hazard and risk-based. So if a substance has hazardous characteristics, but at the moment there is no use that is problematic, we identify that in our risk assessments, but we then say, well, it's not toxic, doesn't meet the test for toxic.
Sorry, if I could, I'm talking about some of the higher risk categories, not just the watch list, but some of the higher risk categories. I know the Senate offered to define it as providing a few characteristics as the definition, as opposed to simply talking about the risk-based analysis.
Right. So substances of highest concern, the regime that we're proposing is that specific actions would have to be taken for those substances, and then in order to define what those substances are, the bill provides authority for the minister, for the government to develop a regulation to define what those are. At the moment, the bill says essentially at a minimum, or for example, that needs to include virtual elimination, carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, et cetera. That's not a problem so long as the actual definition and criteria can be further explicated in a regulation, which in turn can be amended from time to time as science evolves.
Okay, thank you. And a quick final question. I'd asked the minister about how CEPA provides pretty significant guidance to some other periphery acts, including things like pharmaceuticals, acts pertaining to agriculture and food safety. I'm wondering if you could just outline really quickly if work's been done to make sure that, although there's very much a ECCC issue, if there's been consultation across the whole of government.
Greg?
In 20 seconds, please.
Yes, thanks for the question. Indeed, there's been a lot of consultation and engagement across the federal family. We like the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and more particularly the Chemicals Management Plan, is billed as that federal approach to chemicals management. So there's an active dialogue across the health portfolio, including the PMRA in terms of intersections of pesticides, food and drug, and the Food and Drug Act, as well as the intersection with other federal families like Agriculture Canada.
Thank you. So okay, well, we'll go now to Mr. Weiler for the last round. Is it Mr. Weiler?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll end up splitting with Mr. Duguid here.
Okay.
Just to quickly jump into it, in the S5 in section Clause 5 lays out the implementation framework for a right to a healthy environment. Originally, this was just provided for, it would elaborate on things such as the principles to be considered in the Act and research studies and monitoring activities. The Senate, I think, made a very important change, which would include mechanisms to support the protection of that right. And I was wondering if the officials could maybe speak to what some of those mechanisms would be to support the protection of that right, and why that's important to have that in the implementation framework.
Laura?
Sure. I mean, I think the minister outlined some of them in his speech as well. In Part 2 of CEPA, there is already opportunities for the public to bring actions and to ask for investigations. So it would be asking the minister for an investigation when someone thinks that an offence has been committed under the Act, and if the person can say that the minister has not answered reasonably, then they can bring, basically go forward with that to pursue that contravention of the Act. And then there are other provisions in that part as well, which would let somebody bring a civil action for damages if they've suffered damages as a result of the contravention, or an injunction as well. So those are some of the existing mechanisms that exist to enforce the Act, and thus the right to a healthy environment. And I would say, and I just would add too, that in addition to those, what we think of as sort of like court-like mechanisms, there are also transparency and other accountability mechanisms. So the fact that the implementation framework is public, the fact that its implementation has to be reported on, those all actually really are what really help to to encourage compliance and get the shift in thinking and decision making.
I agree. That's a very, very important part of it, but I'll turn the remainder of my time over to Mr. Duguid.
Well, thank you, Mr. Weiler. And I've asked a number of questions of our delegations on the confidential business information provisions of the Act and increasing public confidence. I wonder if any of the officials would have any suggestions on improving that. Ms. Collins, I didn't get a complete answer to her suggestion on select auditing. Would there be a role for the Commissioner on Environment and Sustainable Development? How can we increase confidence that that it is indeed confidential business information? That is very, very important. I think we all agree to protect innovation, to protect IP, and to ensure societal progress.
So it is an important issue, and I would say that there are some amendments that were brought in Bill S5 to help increase or to make it to make the regime run more smoothly and balance that transparency with the protection of the confidentiality. So now, if the bill is adopted, suppliers of information who claim confidentiality would be required to provide reasons for that confidentiality, and having those will make it easier for departments to determine the validity and release the information. There are also changes to the provisions which allow for masked names. So sometimes even the name of the substance is masked to allow for innovation and protect competitive advantage. But now with the amendments, there would be a presumption that could be rebutted, but a presumption that after 10 years, the name could be unmasked. If it goes on Schedule 1, if it's found to be toxic, it would be unmasked. It could be unmasked. Or if it's being risk managed, it could be unmasked.
Okay.
So those are
I've
examples.
got about 40 seconds for one last question. So we're doing, the government is doing, the department is doing consultations on Section 6 and labeling. What happens after those reviews? Are the actions that potentially come out of those reviews, would they potentially be defined in regulation? Do they have to wait to the next round of CEPA? What happens after those reviews?
Briefly, please. Are we pleading the fifth there?
No. So this is a standard process where we identify issues that various stakeholders have addressed and that officials have addressed, and then we go out and talk to Canadians, and then we commit to follow up, and what the follow up will be will depend on what we hear and what decisions the government makes, but there. At a minimum, there will be a follow-up explaining what the next steps will be. As I said in response to an earlier question, that could be procedures, policies, regulatory amendments.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to the officials for allowing us to benefit once again from your expertise, and we look forward to obviously seeing you at the committee often in future. Thank you, colleagues. Have a very good weekend. Stay safe, be good, and we'll see you next week. Okay.